Jazz is an incredibly loose concept to define because it encompasses such a broad variety of music. What is concrete is that it's a form of African American music that was born in New Orleans in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and fused African and European styles of music together.
There isn't one way of describing the style of jazz, though, and throughout the 20th century, the style of jazz was defined mostly by prominent jazz artists and popular culture. We've compiled a list of songs and information from some of the most influential figures in terms of defining the sound of jazz.
It started with the great Louis Armstrong in the early 20th century, who changed the dynamic of jazz music entirely with his unique approach. The song you're listening to now is in the Dixieland or New Orleans style that defined early jazz.
He was the one that made the transition from Dixieland jazz to swing, and integrated jazz with American popular music to make it much more accessible to the audiences. Because of him, the musical focus changed from the overall ensemble to the individual soloist.
Louis Armstrong's music made people feel warm and at home, and his biggest hits like What a Wonderful World and La Vie en Rose have remained in modern popular culture.
Along with Benny Goodman and Count Basie, is one of the most popular and famous band leaders and arrangers.
He was one of the pioneers of big band jazz, and wrote music to capitalize on the popular swing style at the time. He had fantastic soloists in his band, like Johnny Hodges and Jimmy Blanton, who were both extremely influential on their respective instruments.
His main stylistic influence was that he made use of the dissonant voices of each musician clashing with each other to create a unique sound.
That brings us to the great saxophone player Charlie Parker, also known as Bird.
He was an essential figure in the development of bebop, which is a style of music characterized by its fast tempo, numerous chord changes, key modulation, and instrumental virtuosity, and improvisational skills.
Charlie Parker redefined jazz in the way that he would produce incredibly fast musical solos, even at breakneck speeds of 300 beats per minute. His innovative solo licks would be memorized by jazz musicians around the world for years to come.
What was so revolutionary about his improvisation was that he would venture out of the key of tune that he was playing while he was playing a solo. This was known as chord alteration and modulation, which made jazz musicians and jazz fans marvel at Parker's ability.
He, along with the legendary trumpet player and composer Dizzy Gillespie, was one of the pioneers of bebop music.
Speaking of Gillespie, his achievements extended beyond just the revolutionization of bebop, but he, along with the conga player Chano Pozo, practically invented the genre of Latin jazz, particularly in his famous Afro-Cuban style.
The song from before, Night in Tunisia, as well as the song you're hearing now, Manteca, is a prime example of his rhythmically and harmonically unique composition. His composition was a huge influence on jazz musicians like Miles Davis, Clifford Brown, Max Roach, and Arturo Sandoval.
A lot of Latin jazz visionaries today, like Paquito de Rivera and Arturo Sandoval, owe Dizzy their livelihood for bringing them out of communist Cuba in the 60s and into the world of jazz.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Now, we bring you the famous So What from arguably the greatest and most renowned trumpet player in the history of jazz. He gave birth to the cool jazz and modal jazz genres with his highly influential album, Kind of Blue.
His unique style inspired other musicians to pursue a moodier and relaxed form of jazz. Eventually, he would work with jazz great John Coltrane to pop out 4 of the most popular albums in the 50s. He created a trend where songs would be recorded in spontaneous single tapes, and bands would discover their full potential on the spot as if they were playing live.
After a long stretch of heroin addiction, the Prince of Darkness made an electronic comeback in the 80s before dying at the hands of pneumonia.
Fortunately, though, jazz found a new voice in the experimental Thelonious Monk, who was one of the architects of bebop, and also one of the most respected composers and pianists in all of jazz music.
He had a very unique style of piano playing, which included a lot of dissonance and a percussive attack, as well as dramatic use of silence and hesitation.
His composition, Round Midnight, is the most recorded standard in history, and Monk is the second most recorded jazz composer after Duke Ellington.
This is interesting because Ellington wrote 1,000 pieces as opposed to Monk, who only wrote about 70. Moving forward, we have one of the greatest jazz bassists, band leaders, and composer of all time, Charles Mingus.
He was particularly influential in the hard bop jazz idiom, a style of music that drew heavily from gospel music as well as rhythm and blues.
His most famous album, Mingus Aum, was released in 1959, which includes one of his most famous compositions, Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, an elegy for saxophonist Lester Young.
That brings us to one of the greatest tenor sax players and songwriters of the 20th century, John Coltrane.
He was most prominent in the late 50s and early 60s in creating an effect called sheets of sound, where he would play multiple notes at once on the saxophone.
One, two, three, 1, 2, 3.
He formed a quartet with McCoy Tyner, Jimmy Garrison, and Evan Jones. Together, they produced the 2 of Coltrane's most famous albums, Giant Steps in 1960 and My Favorite Things in 1961.
He revolutionized jazz with experimental techniques that borrowed sounds from other cultures like Africa and Latin America. He earned the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award for his influence in jazz, and his music continues to have success in Hollywood movies even today.
Dave Brubeck, a piano player, was one of the most influential figures in the development of cool jazz. Along with Miles Davis and Paul Desmond, a tenor saxophonist he played with most of his career.
He was most famous for experimenting with odd time signatures, superimposing contrasting rhythms and tonalities, all of which are exhibited in his most famous composition, Take 5, which is in the 5/4 time signature.
Brubeck's album Time Out, released in 1959, was the first jazz album to go platinum, and would be an inspiration for all jazz artists to come. Hearing the music of Herbie Hancock, an influential jazz pianist who came to prominence in the 1970s.
He was one of the first jazz musicians to embrace funk music and synthesizers, and he actively used them in his own music. Hancock's improvisational style had a unique blend of jazz, blues, as well as modern classical music.
Many of his songs crossed over and achieved success among pop audiences, especially his album Headhunters, released in 1973, which included hits like Watermelon Man and Chameleon.
Although the golden age of jazz is over, it still continues to evolve with the musical trends of the present, spearheaded by artists like Christian McBride and Kamasi Washington.
The future of jazz could go anywhere. We can only wait and see what new direction it takes.